we will move to Now we will move to the next presentation by Jennifer Devine, who is an associate professor at the Department of Geography in Texas State University, and she will talk about the cattle cocaine supply chain in Central America.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. This is incipient research. I'm a qualitative researcher, part of a really dynamic and large team, many of whom are here today. So I look forward to getting your feedback and your questions. Okay, here we go. Over 10 years ago, my colleagues started to study the relationship between cocaine flows in Central America and deforestation. And indeed, in 2014, a paper was published led by Kendra McSweeney, who we'll talk a little bit later today, looking at that positive relationship. And we coined the term narco-deforestation, but drug war deforestation is a better term that captures the true sort of underlying dynamic that is leading drug trafficking organizations to seek out more remote spaces to traffic drugs to avoid interdiction in the context of the war on drugs. A subsequent study by Steve Cesny, also part of the team, really started to look more narrowly at this relationship, and using different statistical methods has estimated that 30 to 60% of deforestation in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala is driven by drug trafficking organizations in the context of the war on drugs. But what is the mechanism that is causing this drug war deforestation? The answer is cattle, narco-cattle ranching. I first heard this term studying community forestry in the Maya Biosphere Reserve, and community foresters told me that narco-cattle ranching was the primary threat to their social environmental justice movement and the forests of the Maya Biosphere Reserve. So the purpose of this project, looking at the cattle cocaine supply chain, is to identify and describe how diverse shared industrial practices connect the cattle sector and the cocaine trade in Central America. And our working hypothesis is that there are multiple intertwined industrial practices connecting these two trades, which form a hybridized cattle cocaine supply chain. That is to say that the cattle industry and drug trafficking, cocaine in particular, have become so intertwined along the supply chain that they've become inseparable. We believe that this research advances knowledge on prohibition geographies, the unintended consequences and adverse effects of the war on drugs, which has implications not just for the environment, but for illicit industries making their way into illicit industries. There are also implications for food supply and food security, global food supplies. And of course, with cattle and deforestation, there are implications for climate change. And our team has really had to pull from diverse data sources, bringing together different skill sets in terms of methods to be able to answer these questions. So we're also trying to write a paper right now, publish a paper looking at dynamics of convergence research and team science that have enabled us to do this work. Our story starts, and my ethnographic research is based in the Maya Biosphere Reserve in the northern part of Guatemala. And from 2000 until 2023, agricultural and ranching land cover has doubled from about 13% to 26% in that 23-year period. At the same time, forest cover has decreased by about 15%, from 81 to a little less than 70%. We're accounting for also land cover change in loss of wetlands and savannas that are also related to narco-cattle ranching. So you can see this deforestation over time. There's a spatial pattern. Narco-cattle ranching is located primarily in national parks that should be the best conserved. That you can see highlighted here in the western part of the Maya Biosphere Reserve. In contrast, the east has been better conserved, better conservation outcomes. I'm happy to speak to that in the Q&A. But for today, we're going to narrow in on what's happening in the western part of the MBR, which is also happening in Honduras and Nicaragua, those three countries where we identify narco-cattle ranching to be driving deforestation. So here's a look at the first cut at the supply chain. It's comprised of at least 5 nodes, and I'm going to work you very quickly through these 5 nodes as sort of a conceptual exploration of how the cocaine supply chain is connected and operating. So first, as I mentioned, in the context of prohibition geographies and the war on drugs, drug trafficking organizations are seeking out more remote, less densely populated areas with less state presence, and that happens to be those national parks where no one is allowed to legally live or work or extract resources. What this has caused is a proliferation of illicit markets, land speculation, land grabbing, sometimes driven by drug trafficking or criminal organizations, sometimes by speculators who are looking to get in on this dynamic. So what we see is a lot of deforestation, regrowth, a lot of dynamic land cover change in relationship to these speculative markets. Now, in some of these cleared places, we actually have the practice of narco-cattle ranching. And we can use remotely sensed imagery to really determine what's driving deforestation. Like many places across Latin America, the big, powerful actors behind this deforestation are protected by people in power. And elected officials are happy to blame poor peasants for deforestation, for illegally squatting on protected area lands. And sort of a moral and ethical commitment, I wanted to answer the question, how much of the deforestation is large-scale narco-capitalized ranching versus subsistence farming, subsistence cattle ranching? So we set out to answer that question, looking at the role of narco-capital and narco-cattle ranching in deforestation. We've got a paper in land use policy that I led looking at this, but a long story short, we took very conservative measures, large-scale, large extensions of cattle ranches, more than 10 hectares, more than a peasant who's illegally farming or living in a protected area would ever have the means to clear. And we sort of looked at thousands of images and visually classified those images to determine where large-scale, large-capitalized ranching was occurring. And what we found out in our sample was that on average, 69% of deforestation in the Maya biosphere is this large-scale, quickly transformed patches of forest that have been deforested. This is narco-cattle ranching. So we were able to take this evidence and clearly demonstrate that it is these larger, powerful forces behind deforestation. The third node in the supply chain is smuggling. So once the cattle are moved into the Maya Biosphere Reserve, they're fattened, it's time then to get them to Mexico where they will be sold and processed. And so we understand that cattle and cocaine are being smuggled simultaneously through this landscape in a diversity of direct and indirect ways. Directly, there are over 200 illegal airstrips in the Maya Biosphere Reserve, and they're in the middle of these large-scale cattle pastures. Indirectly, and at a much smaller scale, we suspect that cattle and cocaine are moving together. There's some media reports speaking to that. But what's really at play is what we have referred to as territories of impunity. Once drug traffickers lay down land routes to move drugs through the Maya Biosphere Reserve, we're moving from Honduras across to Guatemala, into the Maya Biosphere Reserve, into Mexico, and then often to northern markets. What's happening is once they gain that territorial control, all sorts of illicit economies can move and flourish in those spaces. And illicit cattle ranching is just one of those. We could also speak to timber, we could speak to smuggling and trafficking of migrants, extraction of jade. And what's really amazing is that despite the fact that we believe that there are up to 1.4 million cattle entering from Guatemala to Mexico a year, the legality and the statistics only account for 10,000 head of cattle. That is to say, upwards of 95%, if not more, of cattle coming from Guatemala to Mexico is entering the country undocumented, illegally. And a colleague of ours, Yankwik Mayashi, has actually looked at sort of deficit statistics, how much cattle is produced in Mexico versus how much is actually grown, produced, processed, and that's where that figure comes from. The fourth link in the chain is laundering. Once the cattle cross into Mexico, they have left the Central American common market. And now, for the first time, a receipt needs to be given, needs to be produced for the purchase and sale of cattle. And to be able to do that, there is a large-scale $20 million black market of ear tags that are on the other side of many of these blind plazas, these blind passes that predominate the Maya Biosphere Reserve. So Insight Crime has estimated that there's a large-scale illicit market of ear tags and also falsification of veterinary records that demonstrate a legal provenance of the animals. Now, a lot of these animals are actually entering the North American food supply. So we have concerns and implications for food security. Indeed, Mexico exports 80% of its beef to the United States. 22% of beef in the United States comes from Mexico. So a lot of these cattle are actually coming to the United States and Canadian food systems through these networks. Lastly, money laundering. Once the cartel is able to sell the cattle to Sucarne or whatever major processor slaughterhouse in Mexico, what happens is that cash is transferred wired back to Guatemala or to Honduras, and now there is a transaction, a way in which that money, that capital can be documented. This is a fantastic money laundering mechanism. Once, because cattle's been around for a long time, it's a large market in terms of its economy, it's almost completely informal, and also, as I mentioned, there's dynamics around free trade, particularly the common market in Central America, that allow producers within Central America to buy and sell cattle without receipts. But once you go to Mexico, you have to legalize the transaction, so bam, they have an excuse for where the money came from and why it didn't have to be documented before it was sold in Mexico. I want to conclude by just reminding all of us that at the root of this dynamic is not drug trafficking per se. It is the war on drugs. It is the war on drugs that is pushing drug trafficking organizations into protected areas to seek out remote smuggling grounds. It is the war on drugs that creates these huge profits that have to be laundered in cattle and many other industries. And with that, I will end, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. We have time for one question.
Thank you. Hello, Jennifer. Excellent presentation. Very, very interesting. I just have two quick questions. One, is this the narco trafficking in cattle? Is it a new trend or a significantly new trend? And is it largely, as I think you said, largely confined to formerly protected areas?
Can you repeat that second part?
Is the deforestation from the narco cattle largely confined or concentrated in formerly protected areas like the Biosphere Reserve or national parks and so on?
Great, thank you. Yeah, the first question, this has been going on since about 2000. We want to think about war on drugs policies being implemented here in Mexico during the Pan administrations. And that's when we had the balloon effect from trafficking in Mexico to Central America. So rather than packing up and going home, the drug traffickers moved their operations into northern Guatemala. It's 50% of the border with Mexico. So we see the highest deforestation rates, and my colleague Matt, you can speak to this, right around the mid-2000s. That correlates, at least conceptually, with the war on drugs policies being implemented in Mexico. Your second question about protected areas. This dynamic narco-cattle ranching, narco-capital is circulated throughout the cattle sector in the region. But we have focused on its environmental impacts in protected areas because of the signature and the impact. So where this is happening is in protected areas, but in national parks. Thank you for giving me a chance to end with saying what's working well in the Maya biosphere are the protected areas that are in the multiple use zone, where communities are allowed to live, work, and sustainably extract resources, and they're doing the work of governance and implementing conservation law that's not happening in the national parks, despite the fact that they should be the best protected areas in the protected area systems.
Thank you. And now we have the presentation of Jamie Burton, who is a PhD candidate at Humboldt University in Berlin, and he will talk about livestock frontiers in South America and tropical dry forests.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here today. I'm happy to present what is the first chapter of my PhD study with all of these colleagues mentioned here. Some of you are here today, some in Berlin or in Argentina. So I begin by asking why livestock? Why map livestock? Livestock are creatures of the Anthropocene in that they contribute to widespread ecosystem transformation. They occupy 80% of the Earth's arable land. They're one of the main contributors of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And livestock in South America, in particular, the livestock sector produces 22% of the world's beef. It supports the livelihoods of millions of people. It's a form of income and protein, but it also produces unsavory environmental and social outcomes, including deforestation and biodiversity loss, as well as smallholder displacement and restricted access. So our study region is in the dry diagonal, which is this sort of one of the dry diagonals of South America, tropical dry forests, which includes the Chaco, the Chiquitano, the Cerrado, and the Caatinga. It's actually 4.2 million kilometers squared of dry forest. It's a very extensive, large region, which is rich in culture and biodiversity, and also hosts a diversity of livestock systems. So these systems, what are they? One of the most prevalent systems is small ruminant systems, so smallholder goat farming, or sheep farming, which might look a bit like this from satellite imagery, has a particular pattern often embedded in forests. We also have smallholder cattle systems, which might look a bit more like this, similarly embedded in forests, but with more area cleared for pasture. And we also have capitalized cattle systems, so your cattle fattening systems, which we can see from satellites, often in feedlots, climate areas, decoupled from the land, often surrounded by croplands that fed with crops and byproducts of crops, and the more expensive and traditional breeding and rearing systems, which cover much larger areas, with sometimes in natural grasslands or with implanted pastures. So why map livestock and what's been done before? Well, like the existing maps have mainly focused on densities of livestock, and they rely on coarse and downscaled data. They don't capture the diversity of livestock systems, the systems that some of the ones I've just shown, nor do they explain how and why livestock systems are distributed. So we're asking this in this research, what are the main livestock systems in the dry diagonal? What are the social-ecological determinants of livestock systems? And how are these systems distributed? In order to have a better understanding of the geography of livestock systems. So we had around 200,000 points of livestock throughout the whole study region, which had information on herd composition, and covered, like I said, the Chaco, in Argentina, in Bolivia, the Chiquitano, and in Brazil, the Cerrado and Caatinga. This included some of the data that Holly talked about before. In Brazil, livestock vaccinations in Argentina, and livestock census data in Bolivia. So how did we identify the livestock systems? We can see from satellite images how they looked as one as one input. But we also had information on the herd composition of livestock. So we could look at the proportion of each livestock group per farm. So for instance, on a smallholder goat farm, you might see this purple block, which is just goats there, and quite a small number of heads. The cattle breeding and rearing system might look a bit more like this, with a more even share of calves and cows, as well as heifers, like young female cows. The cattle fattening system, we can see has much more steers in the system, which are male castrated cows and cattle, which are on the last stage of production before slaughter. So in the end, we went through this process, we labelled the data points that we had, we used an active learning model to do that. So I don't, if anyone has any questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it after. But in the end, we identified 4 smallholder systems, which included cattle, smallholder cattle, smallholder cattle dairy, smallholder sheep and smallholder goat systems, and 7 capitalized systems ranging from larger sheep and goat systems, cattle dairy, and your extensive breeding and rearing, and large scale breeding and rearing, as well as the more intensive fattening and whole cycle systems. And then we looked at the spatial determinants, so we fit several predictors. I don't know if you can see them very clearly here, but they included travel time to cities, distance to slaughterhouses, aridity, woody and non-woody natural vegetation, soil variables, so carbon content and water content, as well as distance to water bodies and the ruggedness of the terrain. And just to highlight a few results, so when we look at aridity, we see that smallholder systems were highly associated with arid regions, and vice versa for the capitalized cattle systems. And when we look at soil water content, which is an indicator of agricultural viability, smallholder systems were in areas of lower soil water content, and more capitalized systems were vice versa as well. So you could say, we also saw that in terms of vegetation cover, that goat farms were highly related to, or highly associated with forest cover, less so with natural grasslands and non-woody vegetation. And when we look at the extensive systems, the large systems we found were highly associated with natural grasslands, less so in forests with woody vegetation. And in the intensive systems were sort of decoupled from both woody and non-woody vegetation, so a low association. So using these spatial determinants, we then predicted livestock across the study region. So we were able to look at the combined probability of smallholder systems and overlaid it with forest cover. You can see, as the spatial determinants showed, that subsistence systems are highly associated with woodland, and is vice versa with the capitalized systems. And we were able to look at the individual systems and map them across the whole study region as well. So this map shows the highest probability of each system in 2.5 kilometer grids throughout the whole study region. And we saw that small ruminants were most likely in the dry chaco, Kitsinga. And we also found pockets of the large-scale, extensive cattle breeding and rearing systems in the humid chaco and the Araguaia Basin in Brazil, which we know to be like old agricultural frontier areas with large extensive natural grasslands. So it seems to make sense. So in conclusion, we were able to map diverse livestock systems using large-scale datasets. And we did this at an enhanced scale and detail than what had been done before, which we think gives a better understanding of livestock system geography, which can be useful later on for improved sustainability assessments and policy planning. Also, there's environmental justice concerns. We saw smallholders were restricted to less productive areas and to harsher climates, such as arid regions. And we also, in the context of my lab, which is a conservation science lab, we hope that this sort of information can help us move past simplistic representations of land use in conservation science. So, yeah, thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free.
We have time for 2 questions.
It's funny as well.
Hello, everybody again. Hi, Jamie. Quick question. I might have missed it, or I might not have said it. I'm not sure which. Your mapping, did you identify, say, livestock type? Is it specific to cattle, or could you have herds of sheep and goat apart from cattle in your mapping?
So on each of the datasets, we had information on the cattle group, so like heifers, cows, calves, steers, bulls. For sheep and goats, we just had sheep or goats. So we didn't have that level of detail for the small ruminant species. But yeah, we were able to sort of map, just look at each point and see which group was there, and sort of from our understanding, from our knowledge before, sort of say what type of system it was.
Sheep and goats or cattle.
Yeah. And from the composition, you can tell the production orientation, if it's a fattening system, a whole cycle system.
Good, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Very nice job. I was wondering if you have all these classes, all these categories, but probably something that would be very nice to include is that land that is not used for agricultural purposes, but probably used for land speculation. Just having the land and don't do anything there. Just like having the market available for future investment. Thinking about that category, what might be the approach to do that? Because that is a more complex class to be mapped. Yeah, it's just.
You mean to like show on the map the areas where non-livestock? Yeah. No, I think that's important. But yeah, we didn't have any fields limitations or anything, so we just sort of made a very basically limited spatial determinants that we had. We could include a lot more variables to capture more detail and to also mask out areas as well in more detail. We didn't mask out protected areas in this map, but we will in the next step of the analysis. It's in many ways it's a simplistic representation of what it might be on the ground, but it was just an exercise to sort of see where the most probable areas where livestock could be. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are there. In the manuscripts we show the probabilities, right? The uncertainty of each of the areas, which varies a lot, which we could like use to say the lowest probability areas are areas where probably there's not going to be livestock, and then include that as a class. That could be. It's a good point. So thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. Your results in the northeast of Brazil.
Yeah.
It looks, at least at first glance, that classify a lot of it as smallholder cattle.
Yeah.
Which I just thought was a bit surprising, because there's also a lot of sheep and goats. In that region. So I was just wondering, why do they not crop up? And do you think there's any? Do you think that the likelihood of capturing cattle movements or records is the same as capturing other animals? Do you think about any biases in the underlying data which might affect how you classify the system?
Yeah, I mean, in the map that I showed at the end, that was the it's like the maximum probability of the system there. So yeah, when you look in more detail at the other layers, you see that there are goat and sheep systems there. The question about transactions, like I didn't fully get that, but I can speak to you after about it. But yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Jamie. And now we have a presentation by Macarena Tasker, who is a PhD candidate at CONICET, Argentina, and also Humboldt University in Berlin. And she will talk about understanding the vulnerability and resilience of cattle ranching systems against droughts.
Thank you, everyone. So, climate change has accelerated the frequency and intensity of drought in the last century. So, nearly half of the world's ruminant livestock are located in these areas, which make these livestock systems highly exposed to droughts. For this reason, this is the reason which led us to ask how do cattle ranchers respond to droughts in the dry forest regions. Before to say how we respond these questions, I will say what we expected. So we expected a reduction in cattle stock after the drought. Also, we expected a change in their system production in a long term. And the last option will be they leave the production or exit from the production. So we focused on the Argentinian dry Chaco, which is one of the large semi-arid regions, home of diverse actors, and which have a high rate of land use transformation. Livestock systems in Argentina contribute 12% of the GDP, which in this region we can find 5 million heads of cattle, which is the 40% of the national production. So we first, to address this question, we did a drought characterization where we use a SPI index to map the frequency and the intensity of the droughts during the period between 2010 to 2019. We found that the 90% of the area was affected at least with one drought event. And in some areas, we found until 5 droughts during this period. So to understand how these droughts affected this different system production, and I think Jamie explained a little bit how was the data. We worked with cattle vaccination data, and we selected 8,700 medium and large-scale farms, with information for all the period between 2010 to 2019. And we create a new system, a new index to characterize different systems in this area. We are only working with cattle production, so we selected different, the most common system in the Chaco, which were breeding, complete cycle, fattening, and rearing. So we assess resilience through two properties or components. Absorption, like the capacity of maintain or increase their cattle stock after the drought, and adaptation, like the change of their productive orientation after the drought. Okay, what we found was really different we were expecting. We found that after the first drought, they increase or even maintain their production, which was a surprise. But when we analyze what was happening after when they have repeat events, we found that how much events they have, this capacity of absorption was decreasing. For adaptation was, we can say was something that we were expecting. So these systems are really dynamic. So how you can see here, maybe it's a little bit complicated, but what I want to show here is like these systems are changing all the time. So after the drought, we found that this system, the 70% of the system, changed during the next 2 years after the drought. When we analyze how the system were changing during the old period, we found that the 47% of the farms changed after the first drought until the end of the period. So, to a deeply understanding or complete understanding of these responses, we went to the field and interviewed these other farmers. Okay, what they say? They have a lot of different responses after the drought, but we can say, to resume this, of course, they changed their system production, which is not in a long term. They changed really was quite easier for them. And of course, they diversify. They change their system production, and also they could combine this system with crop, for example, and other activities. They also say yes, they maintain or even increase their stock. When they increase when they look for an opportunity. When they have a drought, some of them are prepared and they increase their stock, buying from another ones. And they maintain and only decrease their stock in extreme cases, which when we are asked for why was happening this, they say, yeah, so this is our capital, we don't want to sell our capital. They prefer apply supplementation, they improve over the time their management practice, which was super helpful for them. And one repeated answer, which was surprising, many of them decided to still produce cattle, still when they have negative numbers, because they like cattle ranching. So some take-home messages will be okay. Cattle production have shown a considerable resilience, but when they have extreme or repeated events, this capacity declines. And another answer, which was really important, was this one, which integrates approach which combines livestock and forage management, were capable to sustain their production over the time. Thank you.
We have time for 2 questions. Do we have any questions?
Thanks for that great talk. I'm curious, this is not my field at all. I'm curious about adaptation, like what you were seeing people do in response to these droughts. Like, do they put in wells so that the cows have water in the short term? Are they putting in wells to get water from the ground? Or other sort of ways that they can bridge that time between when there's not enough rainfall? Or is it all about the forage, right? So is it about cows being able to access water to drink? Or is it about forage, and how are they dealing with those temporal challenges, maintaining the stock over time?
Okay, thank you for the question. So it's not about the water, it's more about forage. Also because I was doing this analysis with medium and large scale, so they have the capacity to get water for their cows. But the problem is when they experience a drought, the forage is not growing up. So the problem is how they supplement or they give the food to the cows. So this was the big problem with the droughts. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions in one, I guess, which might be out of the scope of your presentation, but you said that 47% of all producers adapt or change. What about rest? What about the rest of the producers? And you mentioned in your previous answer that you had focused, as if I understood correctly, on medium and large scale producers. So can you explain why you didn't take small producers into account and how they could possibly react to the same stresses? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So what happened with the other ones? After they change after the drought during the next 2 years, 70%. The other ones stay with their system production. So, for example, before the drought, is a system production breeding, for example. The next 2 years they will be maintained, or maybe they decrease their stock or maintain their stock, but they don't change their system production. Another ones take like an option, change their system to another one, for example, complete cycle, which will be, for example, give them more diversity in the production, having more categories in their farm. What was the second question? Sorry. And we're focusing on the medium and large scales. First, because the vaccination data was really complicated, and when we are doing this analysis for a long term, small producers many times are not there. Sometimes yes, sometimes not, and we were not really sure about if this data was correct or not. So we decided to focus in that scale, but of course we'll see. So this is only a part of my project. So we will consider to work with these small producers.
Thank you, Macarena. Just for your information, we had to move the presentation by Kendra McSweeney about the agroecological suitability of Central America to the end of the session. So now I will go next. Okay, I'm Sofía Nanni. I am from Tucumán, Argentina, and I will share this study, which is really a project about titled From Conservation to Coexistence, accounting for conflict, for human carnivore conflict in Chaco livestock ranching systems, and it's in collaboration with a lot of colleagues of different institutions. And mainly I will share what me and my team have been doing in the last 5 years, and like the immediate outcome of that is mapping livestock depredation derived conflicts between people and pumas in forest smallholder systems of the Argentine dry Chaco, and how that can contribute to like a better understanding of this in the region. So the presentations by Jamie and Macarena provided a lot of context. I won't stop much on this, but we know that subsistence ranching systems are super widespread in South American dry woodlands and savannas, and we can see that in the dry Chaco here in purple, subsistence goat and sheep ranching is super widespread. And also in the Gran Chaco and everywhere really, but as you can see here, particularly in the Argentine dry Chaco, subsistence ranching systems are associated to forest smallholders, and in orange you can see the persisting forest smallholders households in the last years, and they are very, very widespread throughout all the Argentine Chaco, which isn't really detectable if we look at the land cover map. In the Argentine dry Chaco, we still have around 60% of dry forests and woodlands, but these dry forests and woodlands are largely inhabited by people. So really and this is how these forest smallholder systems look like. at the same time, the Gran Chaco is a forest deforestation hotspot. It has great conservation value. There are a lot of important species there, and many of those species are currently threatened, mostly by deforestation related to the expansion of agriculture and livestock ranching intensive systems. So it's really like a complex system where a lot of interactions between the people living there and the wildlife take place. And that's why I like this approach of, we usually in conservation, we focus on the impact of different human activities on wildlife, which is good and important, of course. But in this context, it's also important to account for the potential impact that wildlife can pose to people, because in the end, that can also bring impacts to that wildlife. And this is sort of like moving from conservation to coexistence frameworks, and that's something that I'm very interested in, particularly in these systems. So for doing this, what I have been doing, and I won't talk a lot in this, but I've been combining camera trapping. In these white triangles, there are a lot of camera trap stations, and then interview survey data to also analyze and explore these interactions between people and wildlife throughout the Argentine dry Chaco. And in these last years, this provided us with a lot of information, and we are interested in biodiversity in general, but for this particular study, we are focusing a lot on the puma, because the puma is the remaining top predator in the Argentine dry Chaco. The jaguars are in super low populations, cause really harm. And in these interviews, we have learned that the pumas are the main species attacking livestock. So that is why we are focusing on pumas in this study. So in these last years, we were able, for example, to analyze the occupancy probability of pumas, and as we can see, in that map, it is very associated to the existing forests. So these pumas depend on those existing forests to survive. When it's not a threatened species, but they still depend on a certain amount of forest. But at the same time, the people in the interviews reported that the main cause of livestock degradation was attacks by pumas. So this sort of provided like this idea of, if we want to preserve pumas but also account for the impacts they might cause to people, we need to address that. And another thing that we explored, and that was very informative to us through the interviews, was that when we analyzed the tolerance, so what people thought about carnivores in general, but about pumas in particular in this case, we found that people were generally intolerant to the presence of pumas, and it was kind of independent of whether they had undergone depredation or not. They preferred that pumas weren't in the area. However, when we explored behavior, so whether people went and hunted pumas, what we saw is that people tended to hunt pumas more if they had undergone depredation. So that led us to think, okay, maybe we won't change attitudes, those are super difficult to change, but if we reduce depredation, then we will change those behaviors that will be helpful for the people and for puma populations. So in that context, that led us to another part of this study, because we concluded that we need to conserve forests. We know to protect pumas and many other species of conservation value in the Chaco, but because these forests are inhabited by people, if we don't work on mitigating these livestock attacks, then it will also be impactful for people's livelihoods. And one question that we ask is, where should these initiatives be prioritized? And this will be I will share the results of this recent study that we published. But another question that we are exploring, and I won't share about that now, is which interventions work more locally to actually reduce these attacks by pumas. And for this particular study, addressing where should these initiatives be prioritized, we sort of made this conceptual framework, and I will talk a minute to explain it better. What we did was combining different sources of information to depict these different, what we are calling these different social-ecological landscapes for pumas and people in the Chaco. So based on the puma habitat use map that I showed you before, we discriminated between habitat and movement in the Chaco, assuming that habitat areas will be the areas with high puma occupancy. This is an assumption, but I will think it works for this case. So we have a fair separation between habitat and movement areas. But then we mapped the conflict risk based on the probability of undergoing depredation, and that led us to further distinguish between safe habitat and movement areas, which we have above in green, and unsafe habitat that we're calling attractive sinks and movement areas that you can see in blue. And then we added another layer of information derived from land cover, and we accounted for landscape resistance to further distinguish within these movement areas degraded versus good quality movement areas, let's say. So we have these different landscapes that include these social ecological dimensions. And that led us to answer where are these safe and unsafe habitat and movement areas distributed in the Argentine triangle. And I will just stop a little because I explained the other sources of information, but I didn't explain how we derived this conflict risk map. So what we did was analyzing the probability of undergoing depredation, and based on the information that we had from the interviews, we explored the influence of different covariates that we knew were important. And the best model included the proportion of disturbed forest around the given area, the number of households around the given area, and whether people raise goats and sheep, so small livestock. And because we were able to map all those variables, we were able to map this conflict risk map, which we then combined with the habitat use map and the landscape resistance map to derive this different coexistent map. And what I think is informative about this is that I said before that around 60% of the Chaco has forest or woodland, but we found that only less than 30% of the Chaco provides safe habitat for pumas or areas where these species can persist and where they won't cause any harm for people. So it's informative, and it also helps to analyze where these unsafe habitat areas and the different categories of movement areas are located. But I wanted to end the presentation thinking what is the utility of beyond having a map of these different categories, and I think that an important utility of this is that it can orient which interventions should be prioritized where. And we have a combination of different interventions that are important. It would be important to protect safe habitat and movement areas. The Chaco has less than 4% of the area under protection. And this is more like a top-down initiative, but it would be also important to work with the local communities to mitigate these livestock attacks by pumas and other carnivores. But to do that, we have to first analyze which interventions work, because there are different interventions and not every intervention is maybe work. It's very context dependent. And then I don't think it would be a priority, but there is also this is also informative to explore where restoration should be prioritized in the Argentine Chaco in particular. That's all. Before I end, I wanted to thank the community that we are currently working in, where we are starting to test an intervention. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Any questions?
Wonderful presentation, really interesting work. I wondered if you could describe some of the, or if you collected data on the problem where the way I deal with my puma problem shapes how you have to deal with your puma problem. Sort of like the spillover of like my decision of whether I'm doing lethal or not lethal control or doing some other thing shapes what happens for you. Sort of the coordination problem of puma.
Okay. Can you repeat the question? Sorry, because what I could.
I'm so sorry. I was really interested by the result. You showed that a lot of the sort of like there's a lot of retaliatory response among farmers, and I wondered. I don't know much about the spatial distribution of farms and the way neighbors interact with each other. I was just curious about if you have data or interest in how, when I choose to deal with pumas my way, it has a spillover effect on you and your farm, and how you have to deal with pumas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that, but really what we saw is that going and hunting a puma was really in response to the attack, and it wasn't that people really did it if they didn't have any problems with the pumas. And sometimes, yes, maybe the attack occurs in a particular household, and then own group of households that people go and catch it, so there might be spillover there, but it's usually in response to the predation and not in other situations. I don't know if that response.
There's time for one more question.
Thank you, Sofía. I'm just curious if this information is interacting, informing at all the forest law use designations, and if so, how? If not, how could it?
No, unlike a lot of other countries and regions, there are not really like specific programs to address livestock attacks in Australia, even when it's super widespread everywhere. I think it could inform the first law in the sense that doing conservation in Chaco, I think, should necessarily account for all the people that live there. And as far as I know, there aren't there are some initiatives, but not particularly about carnivore attacks and mitigations. Thank you. Thanks everyone for participating in this session, and also to the presenters for great presentations. Now we have a coffee break and you can keep discussing things over there. Thanks.